Hello, this is Tony Hiller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Many of the more popular traditional religions like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism have unimpeachable statements of fact. These come in the form of statements like the Lord says or the prophets say. And you can't argue with these statements because of course the Lord and the prophets know a lot more than you do. But the climate religion lacks a god, and their prophets become academics whom they call scientists, and their use of climate models. By using the word scientists say, journalists make their articles above question by about half of the population. It doesn't matter whether any scientists ever actually said what they claim. In this video, we're going to look at a couple of recent examples. Here's one from National Geographic. The Amazon is burning at record rates and deforestation is to blame. The blazes are so huge that smoke can be seen from space, and experts say the fires could have major climate impacts. And here's the NASA satellite photo to back up their claim. You can actually see the smoke from space. Of course, satellite imagery can display even small fires and has been doing so for decades, but that's not important when you're doing propaganda. I used to develop drone imaging software for the military, and they can see things like details in your car and many other things you probably don't want to know about. So being able to see a forest fire is pretty meaningless propaganda. And here's the same story at the BBC. Amazon fires, record number burning in Brazil rainforest, space agency. There's the appeal to the unimpeachable experts. The space agency says so you can't question what they're saying. The National Institute for Space Research said its satellite data showed an 84% increase over the same period in 2018. It comes weeks after the president of Brazil sacked the head of the agency amid rows over its deforestation data. Wow, that right-wing president of Brazil sounds like a really bad guy. And of course the BBC didn't miss an opportunity to attack him. The largest rainforest in the world, the Amazon, is a vital carbon store that slows down the pace of global warming. It's also home to about 3 million species of plants and animals and 1 million indigenous people. This story is sounding really bad. A record number of fires in the rainforest, indigenous people at risk, species at risk, and a meddling right-wing president. And most importantly, scientists at the space agency say so. What more could the BBC ask for? Now let's look at the next page of the BBC article. Football pitch of Amazon forest lost every minute. Brazil wildfires prompt prayers for the Amazon rainforest. Is the honeymoon period over for Brazil's president? Conservationists have blamed the president for the Amazon's plight, saying he has encouraged loggers and farmers to clear land, and scientists say the rainforest has suffered losses at an accelerated rate since he took office in January. Scientists say so. There's the appeal to the prophets right there. Scientists say. And here's a graph showing 75,000 fires in Brazil this year. Now let's go down to the next paragraph in the BBC article, which I've highlighted in red. Meanwhile, the U.S. Space Agency, NASA, said that overall fire activity in the Amazon basin was slightly below average this year. So there was no record high this year, as National Geographic and the BBC claimed. In fact, the year is below average fire activity. In other words, this whole story was fake news. Now let's look at another graph which the BBC and National Geographic are definitely not going to be showing you. This is the number of fires in the U.S. from January 1st through August 23rd, as reported by the National Interagency Fire Center. This year is the lowest number of fires in the U.S. in the past 10 years, and it's down 50% from 10 years ago. With summer winding down quickly, there's been just over 30,000 fires in the U.S. so far this year. Now let's compare that to 1937. This is from the New York Times, Sunday, October 9, 1938. Forest fires, one every 3 minutes in 1937, burned almost 22 million acres. Every 3 minutes on the average during 1937, a forest fire started in the United States, but the year's total of losses was considerably under that of the previous year. The Forest Service of the Department of Agriculture reported today that 185,209 forest fires last year burned nearly 22 million acres of timber. So in 1937 there were 185,000 forest fires in the U.S. compared to just over 30,000 this year. That means in 1937 there were 6 times as many fires. That would be way off scale in this graph. And they said that 1936 was much worse than 1937. What this tells us is that the number of fires in the United States has plummeted over the last 80 years, but you won't read about that in National Geographic or the BBC. This is the actual data which scientists say, not the fake appeal to authority being used by National Geographic and the BBC. Fire is an essential part of the forest cycle. Forests need it to regenerate. According to the Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture, and several other government agencies, in the conterminous United States during the pre-industrial period, 1500 to 1800, an average of 145 million acres burned annually. Today, only 14 million acres, federal and non-federal, are burned annually. In other words, forest fire burn acreage in the United States is down 90% since the pre-industrial period when CO2 levels were very low. I have the impression that most of these climate journalists live in cities and don't understand the first thing about how nature operates. I used to be a wilderness ranger in the Cibola and Santa Fe National Forests in New Mexico and have a slightly different perspective. 10 years ago, there was a huge forest fire just west of my hometown of Los Alamos, New Mexico. This is a view of Los Alamos National Labs looking up at the fire. You can see there was a lot of smoke. It was the largest fire in New Mexico history, and people in Los Alamos were very upset about it. But I wasn't upset at all, because I knew that 70 years of man-made fire suppression had made the forest overgrown and extremely unhealthy. It was ripe for a fire. Rather than getting lots of small fires like the forest used to have, due to fire suppression, now we tend to get fewer, much larger fires. And 10 years later, the formerly overgrown scraggly pine forest is filling in with aspens, maples, and oak trees. The area is much more beautiful now than it was when I was a child, and the autumn is going to be incredibly spectacular with all the colors. This is Toto last month enjoying the former burn area. We never had greenery like that when I was a kid. Climate alarmists often get hysterical about essential processes of nature which they don't understand the first thing about. Now we're going to move from the Amazon up to Greenland. Once again, the press is full of hysterical stories. Greenland heat breaks records, causing tons of ice melt. Time. We're living through a climate emergency right now. We just aren't paying attention. BuzzFeed News. Opinion. Trump distracts from Greenland's grave climate emergency. Los Angeles Times. And then, 440 billion tons of ice are expected to melt this summer in Greenland. Let's take a closer look at that story. 440 billion tons of ice are expected to melt this summer in Greenland. What that means for Earth. Should all the ice in Greenland melt, it would raise sea levels around the world by 20 feet. Wow, that sounds really bad. Scientists are warning that a major heat wave in Greenland could lead to a whole lot of melted glacier ice this summer, 440 billion tons to be exact. This article was written on August 21st, 2019. There's that appeal to the unimpeachable authorities again. Scientists are warning. Now let's look at what these scientists actually show. These are the surface mass balance graphs from the Danish Meteorological Institute. These graphs show what's happened on the surface of the Greenland ice sheet since September 1st of last year. There were lots of days with huge mass gains in Greenland, like 2 consecutive days in November when they gained 22 billion tons of new snow. But the press, of course, ignores all these days with huge mass gains in Greenland and focuses instead on the one day when they had a large mass loss. They're like bad gamblers who only remember the one time when they won and forget all the times when they lost. The melt season in Greenland is over, and about 350 billion tons of snow melted since the peak in May. The melting since the May peak is shown with this red rectangle in the bottom graph. But the important thing to note here is that there's been a net gain of 160 billion tons of snow on the surface of Greenland since September 1st of last year. The press refers only to what's happened in Greenland since the peak in May, and they don't talk about the huge accumulation of snow which occurred prior to that. It's almost like they don't understand that snow falls every winter and melts every summer and has been doing that for tens of millions of years. This year's melt, though larger than average, has been well within the normal gray band for Greenland's surface. In the previous 2 years, there was a much larger than average increase in the surface mass balance of Greenland. In 2017, Greenland's surface gained 540 billion tons of new snow, and in 2018 they gained 500 billion tons of new snow. So over the past 3 years, Greenland's surface has gained 1.2 trillion tons of new snow. That's not exactly what we call a meltdown. These graphs are all from the Danish Meteorological Institute, who are the experts on Greenland. So the scientists don't actually say anything the press claims they say. With temperatures well below freezing on the Greenland ice sheet now, why would scientists expect an additional 90 billion tons of ice to melt this summer? No serious scientist would say anything that ridiculous. I annotated the Danish Meteorological Institute graph to show how the press thinks about climate. All of these large snow accumulation events which occurred during the winter were just weather, but the one warm day was climate. And of course, every year is a record low, even though it isn't even close to being a record low, which occurred in 2012. Now let's look at the warm day which occurred at the beginning of August, which the press got huge amounts of mileage out of. There were lots of press reports circulating that it was the warmest day ever on the Greenland ice sheet, but the Danish Meteorological Institute says that that's complete nonsense. Danish Meteorological Institute, August 8, 2019. Was there record heat on the ice sheet last Friday? No. Quality checks have confirmed our assumption that the measurement was too high. The temperature at the summit was not above 0 degrees Celsius neither Thursday, August 1st, or Friday, August 2nd. So the record heat was actually below freezing. The press rarely reports what scientists actually say, but they use the term scientists say to push their propaganda. There's nothing new about this phenomenon. The press has been doing this for as long as there's been newspapers. This is one of my favorite articles from the Brisbane Courier dated January 10, 1871. Imaginary Changes of Climate. A plentiful crop of speculation from weather prophets and projectors and half-instructed meteorologists, and all the philosophic tribe of Laputa in general, to whom the periodical press now affords such fatal facilities. We've often noticed that in the tabular statements of those compilers of weather records who write to the Times, useful and welcome as their communications are, every season is sure to be extraordinary. Almost every month one of the driest or wettest or windiest, coldest or hottest ever known. Much observation which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. We see exactly the same thing now. Every month is reported as the coldest, wettest, driest, hottest, windiest, whatever ever known. It's all complete nonsense, and it's all based on an appeal to an authority. And in 1907, the monthly weather review of the U.S. Weather Bureau warned against the misuse of meteorological data. Is not honesty the wisest policy? It is wrong to mutilate or suppress the record of an observation of a phenomenon of nature, but it's also wrong to make a bad use of the record. In fact, it is the misuse of meteorological data, not the observing or publishing, that constitutes a crime against the community. Observation and careful research are to be encouraged as useful. Misrepresentations are to be avoided as harmful. The independent press, as the voice of the people, should not only be vox populi, but vox dei, repressing all cheats and hoaxes, defending the truth, and the best interests of the whole nation as against the self-interest of a few. We're in exactly the same situation now. The misuse of meteorological data is at epidemic proportions in the press. And we have the independent press, who are bloggers like myself, trying to set the record straight. The press, with all of their climate fraud, are committing a crime against the community. Like in The Wizard of Oz, the press wants you to believe that their imaginary scientists are godlike creatures. And that's why Toto has to pull back the curtain on these frauds. The prophets and gods of the climate community are actually very little people who are attempting one of the largest frauds in human history. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.